Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, it claims that CT scans could result in 100,000 new cancers, at least in the USA. There is a doubt to that. Added protein to diet, does it really have any benefit? Tennessee has tried to implement faith-based religious exemptions to medical care. Potato skin transplants. Salmon swimming faster due to pain relief, fake citations, let's call them, in a joke paper, and terraforming Mars. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with the headline, that is, CT scans causing an increase in cancer cases, which sounds alarming on the surface. This, however, is perhaps an overstatement for a range of reasons. To start with, the first issue is simply this. They're basing it on the idea that CT scans are being overprescribed. That is, there are far too many examinations done via CT each year in the USA, at least more than unnecessary. And as such, they believe that the excessive exposure to ionizing radiation from these scans will increase the risk of cancer. This is questionable given that the dose of radiation you get from a CT scan isn't that much more than you would be exposed to otherwise normally in a day-to-day scenario. The second reason is that the number of scans has increased by about 30% in the last roughly 20 years. And so this is why they argue that there are excessive number of scans being conducted. And finally, just how they get to that number, that 103,000 cases of cancer. They're extrapolating out not only the fact that they believe CT scans are responsible for about 5% of all new cancer cases, but further, if you were to extrapolate out this number from the 2023 data, that's what you basically be getting. Extrapolating out beyond the line is just that, it's extrapolating. That means you're assuming that the same thing will be consistently true going into the future, which is a relative unknown. It's not to say that there isn't historical evidence to say exposure to radiation is bad. We all know full well that radiation in high doses is bad, whether it be something like skin cancer, or Nagasaki and Hiroshima, or more recently Chernobyl. Despite this, it's not the same thing. The doses from places like Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Chernobyl are significantly higher and for far longer than a CT scan. Think about it this way, if you will. Which would you prefer? Undiagnosed cancer in your GI tract or somewhere else in your body because you didn't get a CT scan, or the vague, peripheral, somehow metaphysically achievable, possible case that it may increase your risk of cancer? Most people are going to argue that I'd rather know I have an immediate problem and deal with that, and consider that I'm trading off a very, 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 very small risk of future cancer against that. The only exception, and the authors quite happily admit that adults are unlikely to be in this scenario, is going to be children and adolescents. That is, children and adolescents do carry a certain higher risk of this occurring, and also females more so than males. But, to be clear about it, it's not exactly clear-cut because the study doesn't have long-term follow-up data, because they're relying on basically predicting what happens. This is basically the medical equivalent of California's slap a sticker on it saying this causes cancer, no matter how small the actual risk may be. In news, those who are antisocial, hikikomori, or just plain weebs will find not only satisfying, but perhaps a degree of schadenfreude, being alone by yourself may be good for you. This is actually a rather tongue-in-cheek observation, but what the study is looking at is whether or not things like dining alone, traveling alone, or living alone have an effect on your overall health, and what they found is that certainly, to some extent, living alone or other isolated activities where you're by yourself can provide certain benefits. Admittedly, those benefits do need to be weighed against downsides, so this is not to say that it's a perfect solution, but that basically being able to be by yourself and not be depressed, sad, or isolated is a good thing. This, of course, is perhaps not realistic if you spend an exceptional amount of time on social media, or if you spend much time on social media at all. And that's simply because, well, it doesn't allow you to be by yourself. It's the constant intrusion of the notifications saying X person has posted this, or someone has liked that, or there's a comment waiting for you to review. On the other hand, it's also somewhat stigmatized because people being by themselves is somehow bad. which, depending on the society you're in, may or may not hold true. So this is an interesting article from the conversation that certainly warrants a greater examination. What warrants arguably a greater concern, but not necessarily observation, is Oregon. Oregon is otherwise known as the state of meth. It will also get a new name soon, the state of Creutzfeld Jakob disease, otherwise known as mad cow disease. This follows 2 deaths of individuals in the state and possibly a 3rd case in the last 8 months. Now, there's a slight caveat to that statement. First of all, one of these has been diagnosed via autopsy. The other 2 are presumptive diagnoses, so they're not entirely certain, but it's possible. Well, perhaps it's better to say it's very much likely the cause. In the United States, there's quite a few cases of prion-related diseases each year, about 350. The difference here is, though, that these are 3 relatively clustered cases in a specific part of Oregon, and that's the key here. The, let's call it thin silver lining to all of this, is that unlike the outbreak in the UK in the 90s, this instance doesn't appear to be related to cattle. By comparison, the UK case was basically they started feeding animal remains to cattle, and then that created a prion disease, which became mad cow disease, and then that spread into the food chain, and from the food chain to humans. It's not believed at this point to be from infected cattle. Keyword there being at this point, because there are other species and theoretically other methods and mechanisms by which the disease could be transmitted to people. In other US-related health news, but this time something of the opposite. Rather than a disease causing problems, it's to an extent the law and faith. It's that Tennessee is trying to bring in laws that would allow for denial of medical treatment based on religious belief. For those of you who aren't aware, America basically has this thing called the Constitution. They had a little thing called the War of Independence over it. And one of the major parts of this is that all faith is equal, or, to put it slightly differently, no faith is more than the other, meaning that if you don't have any sort of religious affiliation, you should get the same treatment as someone who does. Or, if your religious denomination is at odds with another, it doesn't make a difference, so long as it's related to the medical care you're being given. This is where the Tennessee law is going to be a bit of a problem. At a federal level, it's just not going to fly. At a state level, though, it might well work, and that's a bit of a problem. What the law does, it allows doctors, nurses, and insurance companies to basically say, we're not going to cover or provide a particular treatment based on moral or religious belief. This can be a pretty big problem depending on where you are and what sort of treatment you're getting. For example, if you're going into a relatively small hospital with only one surgeon, and that surgeon decides, you know what, for some reason I have a moral or religious objection to that person or this procedure, well, now you're shit out of luck and you'll have to be transferred wherever else next has someone who can provide that and hope that they will do whatever needs to be done, which can be particularly, let's say, deleterious to your health if you're very time sensitive in what needs to happen. For example, you've been shot. Or, in the case of Oregon, you have a meth overdose. In this case, it's not like you can really do much about it either, because, unlike other states, you're not required, at least as far as the law is concerned, to be notified of this change before you go to get the service. So basically, you could rock up in the hospital in an ambulance and be told, yeah, we're not helping you, rather than being told in advance that this hospital doesn't provide certain coverage. So yeah, this is going to be a shit show and a half, at least as far as Tennessee is concerned, for the actual provision of healthcare, which, given the state of Tennessee, is probably not a good thing. Next we move on to halfway between health-related news and diet-related news, but it's having to do with how adding protein to your diet in the form of supplements doesn't really do all that much. And to be clear about it, if you are consuming, say, a vegetarian or vegan diet, you may find the addition of, let's say, extra protein such as whey or similar useful, but certainly it's not going to be a perfect solution for a range of reasons, but others add it simply because they think, well, adding, say, collagen to my coffee, tea, or whatever it is will help me somehow look younger and better. If that really worked, people would be eating jelly all the time, so clearly it's not true, but the belief is there, and sometimes that's enough for people to buy the marketing. Put this in a slightly better context. At the moment, assuming you're an otherwise healthy individual of normal age and there's no particular problems or you're not particularly physically active, you're going to need a bit over 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight each day. The, let's say, a higher end of recommendation from health influencers is going to be above 3 grams per kilogram of body weight each day, and basically twice what is needed. And let's be clear about it, that's what's needed, not actually what you need, say, if you're building up muscle mass. So if you're working in a gym and you want to become swole, or somehow or other resemble the Dunlop man or Michelin man, well, yeah, you're going to need more protein, but for the otherwise average individual, you don't need anywhere near that much. But that's the sort of area and sort of market that's being targeted with these sorts of powders and supplements. The other observation from this article from Conversation is that although, yes, the processed sources of protein that are generally used do come with certain problems. Mostly they're going to lack things like fiber, vitamins, and some of the essential minerals. Now, in terms of the first of these, a lack of fiber is going to cause you some pretty big and obvious issues, mostly constipation. Vitamins and minerals are going to have other effects as well, but essentially you're going to feel that first one more than any others, at least immediately. Also, further to that, let's say, the lack of fiber can significantly increase the risk of things like colon cancer. So this is not just oh yeah, protein is not good for you, at least excessive and extra protein using these sorts of supplements, but that it does carry certain other issues that aren't necessarily as obvious. Shifting now to skin transplant news, but news related to agriculture. It's skin transplant for potatoes. This is admittedly something that we take a fancy to because it does sound rather Frankensteinish, but it's sadly not as exciting as it might seem at first. Essentially, what they've done is received approval in the Netherlands to be able to get various modifications to potatoes that give them literally a different kind of skin. So for example, you have a variety of skin on a potato that makes it red, well now you can make a white version. And this can then have effects on things like, say, disease resistance, the ability for it to be stored for longer, and all sorts of other things. So yes, it sounds all kinds of cool, but sadly not the kind of cool you might initially think of. What they have for now at least is mostly a proof of concept, but that proof of concept is more than enough to get them the approval and allow them to move on to arguably newer and more exciting things, just not using potatoes for actual skin transplants, sadly. What is similar but not quite the same is the use of fake blood vessels in lab-grown meat. One of the big issues, let's call it, in developing artificial meat, so to say, is that you simply can't get a large mass of it. You can get lots of individual cells, but you can't get a large mass. That means that you don't get what could be best described as a homogeneous or at least a solid piece of meat. You instead get something closer to a chicken nugget. This is where providing blood vessels means you can grow these layers upon layers of cells up vertically and horizontally. This gives you everything you need to create an actual thick product far more similar to real meat. This Japanese research presumably took some inspiration from the square Japanese watermelons. It's important to bear in mind that this is not, say, for example, a real vascular tissue. It is entirely artificial, but by doing that, it allows for these hollow fibers to deliver all the necessary nutrition to the cells and take it away. This means that you continuously supply all the cells with everything they need, meaning they always stay alive, always grow, and are far more similar, at least for the most part, to real meat. But it's also not quite there yet. It takes a lot of time, effort, and essentially expertise to create just one 10-gram chicken nugget-sized piece of cell culture tissue. So we're not getting anywhere near fast at the moment. Still at a microscopic level of a kind, we now have virgin male worms and risk-taking behavior. Essentially, why do virgin worms that are males behave like high school boys who are horny? And the answer is very much the same. They want sex. Now, the difference is that, well, it's actually not that different. The male worms do take more risks in order to get that sex to happen, and, well, at least the behaviors to do so are different. However, unlike with humans, the explanation is rather more simple. The roundworms have a single neuropeptide receptor, NPR5, that appears to be involved in making them more willing, let's say, to take risks in order to get laid. What they found in an oversimplified way is once you take away the NPR5 gene, male worms can't learn and therefore don't figure out that doing something risky is going to lead to bad outcomes. When you give them the gene, they have a much better chance of learning that something will end badly if they do it. Kind of like taking your car and going really, really fast will probably wind up with either you having an accident, becoming an organ donor, or losing your car, either in a crash or when the police sees it for speeding, amongst other things. The next piece of news we have for you is animal related, and it's all about salmon. And it's an article from the New York Post which is trying to claim that salmon swim faster due to the presence of painkillers in water supplies. And they're sort of half right, but also mostly wrong. The simplified version of this is that most wastewater management systems just aren't made with the idea of dealing with anything but, for the most part, fecal matter in mind. This means that, for example, pain medication, various hormones, and anything else that gets into the water system isn't really dealt with very well. Now, there are places in the world that do this. Parts of California, for instance, do use reverse osmosis to achieve that exact outcome. They remove everything but the water. But despite that, well, most of the world doesn't. This is where the research claims that clobazam, a medication used for sleep disorders, is in increasing amounts in the water in the area they were looking at, and this led to an increase in the fish activity and the amount of swimming they were doing. This is not to say that the research lacks other data sources, such as laboratory tests of the same sort of thing, using controlled variables and environments, but it also doesn't really explain the wider environmental impact. For example, we don't really have a good idea about the exact dose that, say, salmon would be exposed to, because we don't exactly know whether or not there's variation in the amount that's in the water, when that variation is, what fish are exposed to what, and it makes it kind of hard to say, okay, all of the change in behavior is down to this. They can certainly say that, yeah, okay, more salmon are successful getting to their spawning grounds as a result, but then again, we don't know if that's due to other factors. Climate change is an example of that, although that may be less of a variable than you might think. The other is we don't know if it has, let's say, net negative or positive or no effect at all on the ecosystem at large, and that's another big issue here. In further animal-related news, we have what is arguably very bad things, and that is the raw food industry for pets and the wellness industry associated with that, trying to promote it, is actually causing an increase in risk and, in some cases, death of domestic pets. One of the big plays in this is going to be the outbreak of bird flu at the moment, and it's for exactly the obvious reason. That is, raw food contains live, well, in this case, viruses in the remaining tissues from the animal. Sure, it may be reduced due to the time frame between the animal dying and you feeding it to your pet, but it is still there. This is where the major difference between cooked or at least processed food is better than raw food, because the process of cooking or processing it will kill off anything like viruses, bacteria, etc. To a very limited extent. Raw food is good for animals, but it is in a very, very narrow and specific context, and that context basically being they have no other option, where instead they do have the option of, say, raw food, dry food, or canned food. You're better off giving them good quality dry food, perhaps the occasional serving of wet food from a can or pouch or whatever it comes in, but not raw food, for the reasons mentioned earlier about the issues to do with, well, bird flu is one example, but bacteria can be another, fungi. Worst case scenario, you have something like, say, prion disease. So it's not that this is better for them. It's certainly no more, say, biologically available or similar. It's really not an improvement over what is available. All of this is often ignored, mostly because wellness influencers and marketing seems to win out in terms of who has the better argument, compared to actual experts, scientists, and even in some cases government agencies whose sole job is basically to monitor this sort of thing. In terms of, let's say, authoritative sources, we have a paper where they literally cited references that they didn't need to use because the, well, reviewers insisted, which, yeah, it's rather funny, and not for the first time has this happened. In fact, it's probably happened a number of times, and anybody who's ever dealt with reviewer number 2 will understand that they always have suggestions, but those suggestions don't always make sense. Unfortunately, it's now been retracted, though. which, yeah. The upside is that the publication behind this has clearly stated that the peer review process has been compromised, and that's why the paper has been retracted. Not necessarily because the actual paper itself was bad. Sadly, since Elsevier is investigating it in their terms, we'll never actually know what's happened here or what outcome occurs, because Elsevier's idea of an investigation is basically put this in a deep dark place and hope that nobody ever speaks of it again. Much like, say, childhood trauma, except in this case it's trauma for the people who had to revise, review, and keep resubmitting until eventually this thing was accepted. In technology news, we have a chatbot that has finally sort of passed a test for human-like intelligence. This was, for all intents and purposes, a slightly more rigorous version of the Turing test, and we say slightly more rigorous as the basic Turing test is this. You stick a human on one side of a divider, let's say, and they have a computer screen in front of them, and they engage with whatever chatbot is running on there. And the idea is, can the human engage with it in such a way that they know that what they're talking with is actually a chatbot and not a human? Now, the best possible way of setting this up is that you will mix in humans and the chatbot, and that's why, generally speaking, you need multiple rounds, and in this case there were 8 rounds of conversations. Importantly, as the authors basically say themselves, the Turing test is not actually a measure of how advanced or competent an AI really is. Rather, it's better to say whether or not you could take an AI and put them in the same role as a person, and would there be any appreciable difference, or at least something that somebody would notice, if only eventually. This is more important in some ways, as most people would be aware now that more and more things are being taken over by AI to some extent, and we say AI knowing full well that it's still a very deep learning algorithm and not yet a true AI, but the fact that we creep ever closer to that is a good thing. The last news item we have for you is about Mars and how terraforming Mars is actually much closer than you may have thought. Last week we spoke about the idea of using lichen for this, but there are other options. And of course this does come with a certain fairly obvious downside. That is, if we were to terraform Mars now, which would be ideal for humans there, we'd have no way of exploring what it's actually like, which means that we would have ruined a great opportunity to explore essentially a virgin planet with Earth-like conditions, but after it's lost its atmosphere. If, though, we start terraforming it, we have life on Mars. So it depends on how excited you are about humanity being on another planet. What makes this, let's say, important is not so much that we want to colonize Mars, although that is something that wants to happen. Rather, it's that at the moment, humans can't actually live on Mars outside of either specially built habitats or spacesuits. If you were to try, you would basically have the water in your body start boiling the moment you left the airlock. And being boiled alive by your own blood is pretty high up there on the list of ways they don't want to die. The solution then is going to be, okay, make an atmosphere, and therefore we could have pressure. This would work, except it's nigh impossible, both from a logistics and expense point of view. So is there another way to do it? And this is where the research suggests we just pelt Mars with asteroids. Mostly because these asteroids from the Kuiper Belt would contain a fair number of gaseous content, and that gaseous content would then contribute to that atmosphere, or at least the gradual build-up of an atmosphere. This would theoretically, and understand we say theoretically as there's a lot of other complicating factors, bring the time frame down from millennia to mere decades. At least, again, in theory, as there's a lot of problems with moving asteroids at the best of times, but in this case, moving them around inside the solar system where they can break down, break up, and otherwise get distracted by things like the great big ball of fire in the sky that we call the sun, and the fact that it has a fairly substantial gravitational field that will pull on and cause all sorts of trouble when it comes to moving asteroids. The sort of really worrying sort of end conclusion to this research is the idea of let's strap a nuclear reactor to the back of the asteroid and use that to power an engine that would bring them straight to Mars, which we would hope that they've very carefully calculated exactly how much energy is required and that it will only generate exactly enough energy required to get the asteroid to Mars before it completely runs out and there's no, essentially, a nuclear bomb being dropped on parts of the Martian surface. If we were to follow that particular last line of reasoning, we might inadvertently start an, well, not necessarily intergalactic, but certainly interplanetary war with whatever it is, if it is, living on Mars. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.